Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Right Honourable Tony Blair, and Chief International Affairs columnist for Politico, Susan Glasser.
Well, I guess I get to say good afternoon, and we want to thank Concordia, of course, and all of you, and especially I want to thank the Honourable Tony Blair, who is our guest for this plenary session right now, and there's so much to talk about, I have to say. Prime Minister Blair, we're very honored to be with you today. You're right in the middle of the story once again, whether the story is Brexit and the turmoil of British politics, or I know we're all looking forward to your observations about what's happening here in the United States as well. So why don't we jump right in with that? I know I asked my followers on Twitter, what should I ask Prime Minister Tony Blair? All of them said, ask him about Brexit and Trump. How are they alike? Okay, there were some who mentioned Iraq, but...
Okay. Well, first of all, Susan, it's a great pleasure to be here at Concordia. Thank you very much for having me here. So oftentimes people say to me, you must know a lot about politics. I haven't been a prime minister for 10 years, politics for 30 years. And I say, well, just recently, every time I've tried to predict the outcome, I've got it wrong. So maybe you shouldn't really be asking me for advice about it at all. But I think the drivers behind Brexit and the election of Donald Trump were roughly the same. So a large section of people feeling culturally alienated, society changing in ways they didn't like, feel comfortable with, issues to do with immigration, for example, and then economically alienated. Post-financial crisis, communities, people feeling left behind, feeling marginalized. And so these very powerful forces combined, these objective forces, if you like, then combined, I think, with the extraordinarily powerful medium of social media today, which itself is a revolutionary phenomenon, and they created this great surge of discontent that led to these two results, neither of which I predicted accurately.
Well, that puts you in very good company with probably almost all the rest of us. But why did you jump back in to the political debate in the UK? You have just, in recent days, come back out with a report that suggested maybe there still is a way out of Brexit.
It just depends how important you think this decision is. I think it's a destiny-changing decision for the UK. I think if we, in the 21st century, in the world that's going to have a completely different geopolitics, with the rise of China, India, other large population countries, the United States of America obviously still going to be immensely powerful. So the politics of the 21st century is going to be completely different from that of the 20th century or previous centuries. You have to go back many hundreds of years before you get a shift away from the West like this. Okay, so that's the big picture. Where does a country like Britain fit into it? To take ourselves out of the biggest political union and the largest commercial market right on our doorstep, to which we're now joined by the Channel Tunnel physically, I think is going to diminish us and relegate us as a country. Now, we'll come through it. If we do Brexit, we will come through it. We're a great country. It's a great people. I'm sure we'll survive. But I think this is something, if we can avoid it, we should. And in my view, Brexit is essentially a distraction. It's not a solution. The real solution to the problems of communities left behind, to the problems of cultural alienation, is to deal with the actual problems. If there are problems on immigration, deal with them. If there are problems on communities left behind, invest in education, invest in skills, invest in infrastructure. Make sure that people have opportunity. But don't take the self-harming act of cutting us out of the largest market to which we sell into and the political union to which we're tied geographically.
Is it practical, though, a year after the vote to suggest, is there actually a mechanism by which you could imagine undoing the Brexit at this point?
I mean, the honest answer is I don't know, because you've got to respect the vote. On the other hand, I always say to people that Brexit's it's a bit like agreeing a house swap when you haven't seen the other house. Okay, so you can agree in principle, I want to move. Okay, so I've decided to move. But then when you actually see the other house, you see the neighborhood, you see what it looks like, you do the structural survey, you may change your mind. So my point is very simple. As this negotiation proceeds, let's see what the actual terms of this new relationship are, so that we can judge the existing membership of the European Union against what's on offer. And I think that is a different decision with a different quality of decision-making around it.
It's interesting you use the house metaphor. A lot of people would have talked about it in terms of a very nasty divorce that's still in the shouting phase, as it were. And speaking of the politics of anger and the partisanship, that's one thing that people have compared between what's going on not only in the UK and here in the United States, but in many countries in Europe. Why do you think there's so much of a renewed anger and partisanship in politics? I mean, obviously, there was partisanship when you were prime minister, but was it like this?
No, it wasn't like this, but I think two things have changed. I think the objective circumstances have changed. Post 9/11, people's anxieties about insecurity and terrorism, and then post-financial crisis, people's view that there's a group of people that have done okay, but a large number of people who haven't. And then I do think the way that social media works today and its interaction with conventional media is very important. I mean, I don't know about here, but back in the UK, the media today is really polarized. It's a fragmented media, and its commercial model is often in decline, okay? And I think a lot of the media think their route to survival, commercially, is to take a group of people and keep them in a permanent state of anger and grievance, okay? And you do it on the right and you do it on the left. And the result of that is you get two groups of people who don't really talk to each other, disrespect each other, and trying to build that common ground. I mean, this is what my institute is trying to do, is trying to say, what is the policy agenda that gets you out of the anger and into the answer?
Well, there's a lot of heads nodding here, because clearly a lot of people see the American media as also having fragmented into a much more partisan environment. So do you think that is part of why Donald Trump is so successful? Would you be taking to Twitter now if you were the prime minister again?
No.
You don't have good nicknames you want to call other world?
No. It's just, look, trying to reduce really complicated things to 140 characters is not productive.
I hope the transcript will show, for those who are not here personally, there was a lot in that moment of silence.
Yeah. No, but it's the way it is, though, and you've got to, at one level, admire the sort of the technique and the ability then to drive a message. But this is why the question, I honestly don't know the answer to this, I just want to try, because I think it's so important. Is it possible to get inspiration and enthusiasm behind a sensible way forward? Or does the way that politics is conducted today mean that unless you've got an extreme message, people just don't find it interesting?
Well, people ask, can the center hold? But this is not just on the right wing. It's not just the Tories or the Conservatives or the Republicans in the United States. It's also your own Labour Party in the UK. It's the Democratic Party here in the United States. The rise of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn is also something that has concerned you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a populism of the left as well. The populism of the right tends to target immigration, say, and immigrants. The populism of the left will target sort of business or, both of them, by the way, in a curious way, come to more isolationist and protectionist policies. And I think there are certain points at which I think the far left and the far right meet. But the point is that neither will take, certainly my country, forward. You know, and if you look at the way politics is developing now, I think it's a really open question, as I say, whether it's possible to find a new way forward. On the other hand, I still believe there's a large number of people who are politically homeless and are looking for a home which provides rational, solution-based politics that can be a place of change, by the way, not a place of managing the status quo. It's a place of change, but change that works. I mean, look, if I was back in government today, one thing I would look at, probably number one, is how is the world of technology going to change the workplace, and what are the implications of that? How do we help and guide people through that extraordinary process of change that will come about through AI, automation, big data? How does government take that technology and use it to change, for example, our education system, healthcare systems, and so on? Okay. But here are two worlds, the world of public policy making and the world of those changing the world through technology. They're not meeting.
No, they don't talk
they're not
to
interacting with each other. And yet these changes are revolutionary. So, one of the things that depresses me about the present political discourse is that when you look at the big questions really facing our countries, I'm not sure we're even asking the right questions, and never mind giving the right answers. I mean, another thing I would do is on infrastructure. I mean, I think there's a case today, certainly in the UK, for taking an almost 19th century view of infrastructure. How do we literally build the infrastructure for the 21st century, taking account of all the technology that's available to us in order to link up and join up the different parts of our nation? Now, again, these questions, I don't feel any political energy in them, and yet they're obviously much more important than whether you go after a group of people who happen to be immigrants and target them and turn them into stigmatize them and turn them into an object of dislike by another part of the population. I mean, this negative politics of blame rather than searching for solutions, it's so damaging, I think, to our psyche and to our spirit, quite apart from to getting a solution for the problems the country faces.
Well, it certainly adds to the feeling that the world is in crisis. And here we are in New York, it's General Assembly week. So that's a question I have for you is the world in crisis? And what does it mean to have America playing suddenly a potentially different role in the world? Is America first a problem for international politics?
Well, it'll be interesting. I was reflecting on this because I think President Trump speaks to the UN tomorrow. Yeah. It'd be really interesting to see, because let me just tell you, let you in a little secret, since I addressed the UN General Assembly many times. That is the most difficult audience in the world to address. If you can get any sign of life out of that room, you're a genius. Because I tell you, I tried for 10 years and I failed, and I thought I was quite good at it, and never tell a joke.
Humor doesn't translate, right?
It doesn't translate at all. It's just likely to insult someone quite unintentionally. So I'm quite looking forward to his speech tomorrow. That would be quite interesting. But apart from that, I think what people will, look, that they'll be looking to see if there's some clarity and coherence around where America stands. And the world needs a strong America, and it needs a clear America, and it needs an America that's prepared to stand with its allies and stand up to its foes and generally try and make the world a better place. So people will obviously be asking, does this America First policy, does it mean it's us and you guys go and sort yourselves out? Or is it merely a way of saying, look, we're going to look after our own interests in the same way that any political leader is going to say, I look after Britain first or France first or whatever. So people will be looking for clues to that, and, well, we'll see.
You know, you've actually been somewhat more positive, or at least open-minded toward President Trump than some of your liberal friends. You said that when you came here to the U.S.
That wouldn't be hard, mind you.
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
It's a low bar, that.
You've observed a certain level of hysteria among American liberals when it comes to President Trump. Why is that?
Look, I mean, don't let me hide my own political affiliation. I mean, I'm obviously on the progressive side of politics and would have voted for Hillary had I hadn't voted in the American election. But I guess it's, from my perspective, it's important that the American president succeeds. It's important for the security of the world. And it's important for, the protection of our way of life. So, and I've been long enough around politics to realize that in the end, you've got to give people a chance and see how it settles down, if it settles down. And so, there can be things that this president does that can be justified and right in their own terms, and I don't think you should reject them just because of the provenance of them. So, and also if frankly you're sitting in the position that I am, saying let's have a less partisan form of politics, then that means you're at least prepared to consider things on its own terms, although where I disagree with the president, as for example on climate change, I'm very happy to say so.
Well, for example, on the Middle East, you've been and are still very active as a negotiator on behalf of the Quartet in the Middle East, and that's an area of the world where Donald Trump's opening leaves some potential. You've been somewhat optimistic in a part of the world where it's hard to be optimistic.
It's certainly hard to be optimistic, but I think, I think in the Middle East there are elements of what he's doing, in particular greater commitment of America there, that are very important. So, I keep an open mind on all of this. But I think for me the greater question is, how do you put together an agenda and a program that's going to offer people what I call a rekindling of the politics of optimism? I mean, when I think back 20 years when I first came to power and President Clinton was in the White House, there were many differences between those times and now, but I think the biggest sort of zeitgeist difference was that people felt essentially optimistic. We felt we could find a way through the problems of the world. Okay, there were lots of challenges, but we were quite confident of overcoming them. I think the last 10 years has marked a politics of pessimism and of fear. And what happens when those politics take over is that people retreat, they tend to hunker down, and they're obviously very open to a message that plays on that fear. So for me, the most important thing is, we can have our criticisms of President Trump and whatever, and that's fine. But the task that I want to work on is, when the next election comes here, or the next election comes in the UK, what are the progressive people going to be saying that is going to be able to reunite a majority of the country around our program and show people a way to be optimistic about the future and its possibilities? And this, I think, is a big, big challenge. We did a lot of polling from my institute recently, and we found one really interesting thing. We polled in England, France, and Germany. And this bears out polling in the US as well. If you ask this generation, do you think you've done better than the last generation? They will say yes, we did better than the last generation. If you ask them, do you think the next generation will do better than you? Then for the first time you get a negative to that. And this is the change that's happened, and this is what we've got to rectify.
So are you going to be teaming up with Bill Clinton again on whatever is the successor to the third way?
Well, I think there's a whole new generation of people, but I'm sure he like me is, you don't stop being passionate about politics and ideas. And I think some of that concept around how you break through what is a very 20th century politics of old-fashioned right and left, I think is important still.
So when you look at Europe today, many people see Britain sort of looking inward and consumed by Brexit. Of course, America has stepped aside in a way. Have Germany and France stepped in to lead where the United States and the UK once did?
I don't think they can substitute fully, to be honest. So, I'm a great believer in the transatlantic alliance. And I'm a believer in a strong Europe, and Britain within that strong Europe. And I'll tell you exactly why. You know, I began by talking about the change in geopolitics. You know, I have a 17-year-old son, and I've got a little granddaughter who's almost a year old. The century that they're going to grow up in is going to see the world change in the most dramatic way in terms of political power. And the focus will move from the West to the East. And we will have to share power in a completely new configuration of geopolitics. And the question I have is, what are the values that will prevail in that 21st century? And what we have to understand is that our model of governance, which is basically what you might call liberal democracy, and it's based around essential ideas of freedom. Freedom to choose your government, freedom to speak your mind, the freedom to practice your faith, you know, the freedom to work hard and do well, the freedom not to have an arbitrary human agency or government blunt your ambitions. That basic notion has sustained our societies over many, many years, but it's not the only model. You know, a large part of the world does not live with that freedom, and it lives with a different concept of governance. So if we're not strong and clear and confident and true to our values in Europe and in America, as these big powers take their place on the world stage and will be a different pole of power to us, we've got to be very clear we're going to face a struggle for those values. And therefore, if we're weak and divided, if the US retreats from the world, if Europe breaks up, then our value system's at risk. It's not just about interests, it's about the essential basis of our way of life. So this is what's important to me. And therefore, when I look at the world today, and my own country, I want Britain confident enough to be part of that European family, to stand alongside the United States of America, and you know, going through whatever president you happen to elect, keeping that basic way of life intact, so that as the 21st century develops, those other countries, as they rise, their people too, over time, can get access to those same freedoms. So this is the reason for taking politics seriously today, because it's a big moment of change. And if we go in the wrong direction, then my 17-year-old son and my little granddaughter are going to grow up in a very, very uncertain and insecure world. And the 20th century saw that turn into conflict. The world survived. If the 21st century ever saw us turn into conflict, I'm not sure it would. So what's at stake is very, very big and very powerful and very important. And I think at those moments, you know, if you have a passion about it, you might as well get stuck in.
Prime Minister Tony Blair, I know we could talk all day. You are the quintessential man in the arena, and we thank you for your